Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast. I'm Ollie Barrett in London, and we will start in the UK, where Prime Minister Boris Johnson is about to make a statement in response to the release of the Sue Gray report. That is the report put together by senior civil servant Sue Gray into allegations of parties and lockdown breaching gatherings in and around Downing Street during the COVID-19 pandemic. Boris Johnson on his feet in the House of Commons at the moment with his weekly Prime Minister's question session, and then after that concludes, he will make that statement about the Sue Gray report. Well, let's go ahead of that to our London correspondent, Laura Macon-Isherwood, who joins me now. Laura, the Sue Gray report is out. Finally, the final version of it. What are the headlines?
Yes, it's been published now, all 37 pages of it, plus some photographs that show the Prime Minister and a number of other senior members of the Cabinet and senior aides that assist the Prime Minister in his work. What we've got within it is basically more details about the build-up and then the execution of these events that took place in Downing Street and also in the Downing Street garden as well. Of course, we'd seen photographs in newspapers over the last 6 months or so that led to this investigation being launched. Now we've seen the publication of conversations that took place between members of staff that work within number 10 Downing Street and other ministerial buildings as well, WhatsApp messages that have also been published. And one of the biggest takeaway points from this appears to be the fact that a lot of these events were actually pre-planned. People had suggested they might be able to gather in gardens and bring drinks of their own, bring their own booze, the words that have been used in these conversations, emails and WhatsApp messages. Also this suggestion that in a number of cases, these senior aides believe that they might have got away with organising these events and gatherings and not been found out. There was also evidence that actually some of these gatherings were taking place at the same time that press conferences were being held, where the public were being informed of the various COVID updates and other restrictions that were being put in place, with staff members who were planning to attend being advised to basically be cautious of that and keep noise levels down to avoid being found out. A number of senior communications officials did warn that it could be a comms risk, but it appears that these went ahead, and in some cases more than 200 staff were included in emails inviting them to them. The Prime Minister now is, of course, in the House of Commons for Prime Minister's questions, and he's not been tackled too hard on this situation just yet. We're waiting for a statement that's due imminently.
Well, on that note, Laura, what next for the Prime Minister? We have this statement coming up on Sue Gray. What else?
Yeah, well, he's set to stand and talk to MPs about this publication, of course. The opposition leader, Sir Keir Starmer, wanted to wait for this statement to tackle the Prime Minister and no doubt aim pretty hefty criticism at him. There have been calls as well for the Prime Minister to resign. It doesn't appear that that's going to happen, at least for now. Later on, though, the Prime Minister will meet with the 1922 committee. This is a group of backbench Conservative MPs where they will meet weekly when the House of Commons is sitting, where they can discuss the issues that are applicable to the party and where more junior members of the party can raise any concerns that they have. That meeting, of course, will be quite pivotal in trying to test the mood of Conservative MPs, whether or not they believe that this report is damning enough for any further action. And then we don't know for certain yet, but it appears that there could be some press conference later on today where the Prime Minister may well address the public. That's yet to be confirmed. But he is, of course, going to be wanting to mark this as at the end of what's been a long-running situation for the Prime Minister and those in number 10, where he's been having a lot of criticism thrown at him, calls for him to resign as well. And him and his cabinet ministers are looking to push ahead for the rest of the week to focus on the cost of living, move away from this. But we'll see if MPs, his own and opposition, will allow that to happen.
OK, Laura, thank you. And we will keep an eye on the House of Commons, and when Boris Johnson ends Prime Minister's questions and gets to that Sue Gray statement, we intend to take you back there live.
As the cost of living crisis and fuel poverty could well leave thousands more to die of cold in their own homes. So, Mr. Speaker, when we saw pictures of the PM partying in the middle of the pandemic, was he toasting his assault on the working class? and I ask him, how on earth does he sleep at night with so much blood on his filthy, privileged hands?
Mr. Speaker, from furlough onwards, everything we have done since the pandemic began has been to get money into the pockets of the working people of this country, and those are the people, time and again, that we have prioritised. And I do not for a moment, I do not for a moment doubt, Mr. Speaker, that things are tough. I do not doubt it for a moment, but it is our intention to get this country through it, and we will get through it very well by putting our arms around people as we can and as we will because of the fiscal firepower that we have, Mr. Speaker, but also by making sure that we continue with the high wage, high skill, high employment economy that we have. And the best thing to get money into people's pockets, Mr. Speaker, is to have a job.
Jill Mortimer.
Does the Prime Minister agree with me?
As I say, that is still PMQs, but we will take you back to the Commons when Boris Johnson gets cracking on the Sue Gray statement. But in other news, the UK government has issued a licence that permits the sale of Chelsea Football Club to a consortium led by the American Todd Boehly, the part owner of the baseball giant Los Angeles Dodgers. The sale is also backed by the California equity firm Clearlake Capital. The current owner of the club, Roman Abramovich, is under UK sanctions after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The government had been seeking legal assurances that no proceeds of the sale could make their way to Abramovich or his associates. The Premier League has also sanctioned the sale, which now looks set to go through pending some final international approvals.
But in football, I agree with him, and we have tolerated the investment of Russian kleptocrats for far too long. And yesterday's announcements show that I think that we have reached a turning point. We need to make sure that football clubs remain viable. That is an important point, that they remain viable.
A gunman has killed at least 19 children and 2 adults in a rural Texas elementary school. It's the second deadliest American school shooting in a decade. The gunman's been identified as an 18-year-old man who also died at the scene. The shooting took place at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, a small city west of San Antonio in Texas. The White House has ordered flags to be flown at half-staff in mourning for the victims. President Joe Biden was emotional as he reflected on the attack and called for action.
Okay, so there are 5 new lights.
Why are we willing to live with this carnage? Why do we keep letting this happen? Where in God's name is our backbone? To have the courage to deal with it and stand up to the lobbies. It's time to turn this pain into action. For every parent, for every citizen in this country, we have to make it clear to every elected official in this country, it's time to act.
Ukraine has started gathering the bodies of dead Russian soldiers from among the rubble of formerly occupied towns. Ukraine says it's taking all possible measures to verify the identities of these soldiers in the hope of exchanging them for prisoners of war.
As Ukraine pushes Russian forces back from towns in the Kharkiv region, volunteers are sifting through what the Russians left behind. In this case, the bodies of its soldiers.
From here, we retrieved the body of a Russian serviceman. He was in the basement, in the kitchen. He was left alone when his fellow servicemen retreated. Most likely, he shot himself.
At a recent recovery effort in the village of Mala Rohan, just east of Kharkiv city, volunteers were working to gather the bodies of Russian soldiers strewn among the rubble of formerly occupied towns, and using everything from DNA to tattoos to verify their identities.
In the future, this will tell us which soldier, which brigade was in the region for further exchange.
Ukrainian Armed Forces Captain Anton Ivanikov said the bodies are sometimes used as part of prisoner exchanges and other times in exchanges for Ukrainian bodies. 2 volunteers wrapped the bodies in white plastic tarps and lifted them into a waiting ambulance.
These 2 bodies had their hands tied. Most likely this was done by Russian soldiers themselves. Maybe they were deserters, or this was a punishment measure.
Reuters was unable to verify the circumstances of any of the deaths. Volunteers have helped the military gather 60 bodies in the northeastern region of Kharkiv, where Russian forces have retreated in recent weeks, stacking them up in a refrigerated rail carriage. Ivanikov said the bodies will travel on the train to Kyiv, where the team negotiating exchanges is based. Moscow calls its actions a special operation to disarm its neighbor. Kyiv said it never threatened Russia in any way and says the attack was completely unprovoked.
European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has accused Russia of using food as a weapon in the ongoing conflict with Ukraine to put pressure on the international community. And that is exactly the same allegation in many ways as the European Commission would accuse Vladimir Putin of acting with the energy sector.
Russia is using food as a weapon in its war on Ukraine. That's according to European Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen on Tuesday, who condemned Russia for targeting Ukraine's grain silos and blockading ships full of grain in the Black Sea, saying a food crisis is fast approaching. She spoke to Reuters at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland.
It cannot be in Russia's interest that because of Russia, people are dying of hunger in the world.
Von der Leyen called for talks with Moscow on unlocking some 20 million tons of wheat exports that are trapped in Ukraine as a result of a Russian blockade. 3 months after President Vladimir Putin ordered Russian forces to invade, Ukraine is top of the agenda at this year's World Economic Forum, a gathering of more than 2,000 business, NGO, and political leaders.
And on top of this, Russia is now hoarding its own food exports as a form of blackmail, holding back supplies to increase global prices or trading wheat in exchange for political support. This is using hunger and grain to wield power.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken last week accused Russia of holding hostage food supplies for not just Ukrainians, but also its allegation. David Beasley, executive director of the United Nations World Food Program, told Reuters the world is facing a global food shortage, and Russia's actions are pushing the crisis to the brink.
To keep the ports closed, as the harvest season is now coming in Ukraine in July and August, it means a declaration of war on global food security. If you can't get the food out the fields, I mean, Ukraine grows enough food to feed 400 million people.
Russia and Ukraine together account for nearly a third of global wheat supplies.
Now everyone's beginning to give it the attention that it needs, because the consequences, if you don't, are going to be absolutely horrific, you know.
And we're going to interrupt that report to take you back live to the House of Commons, where Boris Johnson's just getting started on that statement in response to the Sue Gray report.
And of course, I do. But since these investigations have now come to an end, this is my first opportunity to set out some of the context and to explain both my understanding of what happened and also to explain what I have previously said to this House. And it's important to set out that over a period of about 600 days, gatherings on a total of 8 dates have been found to be in breach of the regulations in a building that is 5,300 metres square across 5 floors, excluding the flats. Mr. Speaker, I do think it is important because this is the first time I've had the chance I've had to set out the context. Hundreds of staff are entitled to work, and in the Cabinet Office, which has thousands of officials and now is the biggest it's been in any point in its 100-year history. And that is in itself one of the reasons why the government is now looking for change and reform. Mr. Speaker, those staff working in Downing Street were permitted to continue attending their office for the purpose of work, and the exemption under the regulations applied to their work because of the nature of their jobs reporting directly to the Prime Minister. These people were working extremely long hours, doing their best to give this country the ability to fight the pandemic. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate that this is no mitigation, but it is important to set out
Prime Minister,
context.
please, just one second. Can I just appeal to the House? I expect it to be heard, and I want everybody to hear it. And I want the same respect to be shown to the Leader of the Opposition afterwards. So please, this is a very, very important statement that the country wants to hear as well. Prime Minister.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I'm trying to set out the context, not to mitigate or to absolve myself in any way. The exemption under which they were present in Downing Street includes those circumstances where officials and advisers were leaving the government, and it was appropriate to recognise them, to thank them for the work that they have done. Let me come to that, Mr. Speaker. I briefly attended such gatherings to thank them for their service, which I believe is one of the essential duties of leadership, and particularly important when people need to feel that their contributions have been appreciated, and to keep morale as high as possible. I'm trying to explain the reasons I was there, Mr. Speaker. And it's clear from what Sue Gray has had to say that some of these gatherings then went on far longer than was necessary. And they were clearly in breach of the rules, and they fell foul of the rules. I have to tell the House, because the House will need to know this, and again, this is not to mitigate or to extenuate, I had no knowledge of those subsequent proceedings because I simply wasn't there. And I have been as surprised and disappointed as anyone else in this House as the revelations have unfolded. And frankly, Mr. Speaker, I have been appalled by some of the behaviour, particularly in the treatment of the security and the cleaning staff. And I would like to apologise to those members of staff. And I expect anyone who behaved in that way to apologise to them as well. And I'm happy to set on the record now that when I came to this House and said in all sincerity that the rules and guidance have been followed at all times, it was what I believed to be true. It was certainly the case when I was present at gatherings to wish staff farewell, and the House will note that my attendance at these moments, brief as it was, has not been found to be outside the rules. But clearly this was not the case for some of those gatherings after I had left, and at other gatherings when I was not even in the building. So I would like to correct the record, to take this opportunity, not in any sense to absolve myself of responsibility, which I take and have always taken, but simply to explain why I spoke as I did in this House. Mr. Speaker, in response to her interim report, Sue Gray acknowledges that very significant changes have already been enacted. She writes, and I quote, "I am pleased that progress is being made in addressing the issues I raised." And she adds, "Since my update, there have been changes to the organisation and management of Downing Street and the Cabinet Office with the aim of creating clearer lines of leadership and accountability, and now these need the chance and time to bed in. Number 10 now has its own permanent secretary charged with applying the highest standards of governance. There are now easier ways for staff to voice any worries, and Sue Gray welcomes that, and I quote, "Steps have since been taken to introduce more easily accessible means by which to raise concerns electronically, in person or online, including directly with the permanent secretary." The entire senior management has changed. There is a new chief of staff, an elected member of this House, who also commands the status of a cabinet minister. There is a new director of communications, a new principal private secretary, and another of other key appointments in my office. I am confident with the changes and new structures that are now in place that we are humbled by the experience, and we have learned our lesson. And I want to conclude by saying that I, Mr. Speaker, I am humbled and I have learned a lesson, Mr. Speaker. And I want to conclude by saying that whatever the failings of we'll come to that. And whatever the failings of Number 10 and the Cabinet Office throughout this very difficult period, for which I take full responsibility, I continue to believe that the civil servants and advisers in question, hundreds of them, thousands of them, some of whom, Mr. Speaker, are the very people who've received fines, are good, hard-working people, motivated by the highest calling to do the very best for our country. And I will always be proud of what they achieved, including procuring essential life-saving PPE, creating the biggest testing programme in Europe, and helping to enable the development and distribution of the vaccine which got this country through the worst pandemic of a century. And now, Mr. Speaker, we must get our country through the aftershocks of COVID with every ounce of ingenuity and compassion and hard work. So I hope that today, as well as learning the lessons from Sue Gray's report, which I'm glad I commissioned, and again I repeat I'm grateful to her. And I hope very much that now that she has reported, we will be able to move on and focus on the priorities of the British people, standing firm against Russian aggression, easing the hardship caused by the rising costs that people are facing, fulfilling our pledges to generate a high-wage, high-skill, high-employment economy that will unite and level up across the whole of our United Kingdom. That is my mission, that is our mission, that is the mission of the whole of the government, and we will work day and night to deliver it, and I commend this statement to the House.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The door of Number 10 Downing Street is one of the great symbols of our democracy. Those who live behind it exercise great power, but they do so knowing their stay is temporary. Long after they've gone, that door and the democracy it represents will remain firm and unyielding. But Britain's constitution is fragile. It relies on members of this House and the custodians of Number 10 behaving responsibly, honestly, and in the interests of the British people. When our leaders fall short of these standards, this House has to act. For months, members opposite have asked the country to wait. First for the police investigation, which concluded that this Prime Minister is the first in our country's history to have broken the law in office. Then they asked the country to wait for the Sue Gray report. They need wait no longer. That report lays bare the rot that under this Prime Minister has spread in Number 10, and it provides definitive proof of how those within the building treated the sacrifices of the British people with utter contempt. When the dust settles and the anger subsides, this report will stand as a monument to the hubris and the arrogance of a government that believed it was one rule for them and another rule for everyone else. The details are stark. 5 months ago, the Prime Minister told this House all guidance was completely followed in Number 10. Yet we now know he attended events on the 17th of December. At least one of those attending has received a fine for it, deeming it illegal. We know that on the 18th of December an event was held in which staff drank excessively, which others in the building described as a party, and that cleaners were left to mop up the red wine the next day. On the 20th of May, as a COVID press conference was taking place, one of his senior officials was told, "Be mindful, cameras are leaving, don't walk about waving bottles." It is now impossible to defend the Prime Minister's words to this House. This is about trust. Because during that May 20 press conference, the British public were told normal life as we know it is a long way off. But that wasn't the case in number 10. Even now, after 126 fines, they think it's everyone else's fault but theirs. They expect others to take the blame whilst they cling on. They pretend that the Prime Minister has somehow been exonerated, as if the fact that he only broke the law once is worthy of praise. The truth is, they set the bar for his conduct lower than a snake's belly. And now they expect the rest of us to congratulate him as he stumbles over it. Number 10 symbolises the principles of public life in this country: selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, leadership. But who could read this report and honestly believe the Prime Minister has upheld those standards? The reason the British public have had to endure this farce was his refusal to admit the truth or do the decent thing when he was found to have broken the law. This report was necessary because of what Sue Gray describes as failures of leadership and judgment for which senior political leadership must bear responsibility. It is that failure of leadership that has now left his government paralysed in the middle of a cost of living crisis. The government has turned the focus of his government to saving his own skin. It's utterly shameful. It is precisely because he cannot lead that it falls to others to do so. I've been clear what leadership looks like.
Utterly shameful, says Keir Starmer, the leader of the UK's opposition Labour Party, in response to the report from civil servant Sue Gray about parties in and around Downing Street that breached COVID-19 lockdown rules. Boris Johnson has given his statement and will now respond to questions from MPs. We will be back at the same time tomorrow.
This is right, Arab.